Welcome back to the shop, everyone. This week's video takes place in 2023, week 21, May 22nd to May 28th. And here we are going to start out with me unloading some new to me heads. As I mentioned in the last video, I destroyed my last set of heads, so I needed to find some to go on the engine. And, I was pretty fortunate that I was able to find some locally for a reasonable price. I paid $100 for them. They're used iron heads. But for, what we're going to be doing, they should work all right. So what we are doing now is we are going to start pulling the main caps off the engine. So these are the main bearing caps. The crank sits between two pieces of metal, and then oil will go between the crank and those two pieces of metal so that you never have metal on metal in the engine. And so I'm just inspecting these. And when I pull this first cap off, I see that the bearing is down to the copper. So typically those are going to have a light gray silver-ish color. But as you can see, that bearing was entirely copper. So that's not good. That means that this crankshaft has been making contact with the bearing, which is something you never want to do. But that's why I figured, since I got the engine this far apart, I might as well check them anyways. I can replace the bearings, and once I replace the bearings, we can get some more life out of this. We can get the amount of life that we need out of this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start undoing all of the main caps, as well as I'm going to undo the rods. So the rods have the same idea. They have a bearing on either half of the rod, and those go around the camshaft or crankshaft, sorry. And through oil pressure coming through the engine, there's a thin film of oil that sits between the bearing and the rod, and that's what protects your engine, because metal on metal is never good. So having those bearings with a little bit of oil is all you really need to protect your engine. As I'm undoing these bearings, as I get further down the crank towards the front, the bearings are starting to look a little bit nicer. So when I was speaking with a machinist, what he said is that usually means that the assembly is out of balance. So either is using the wrong flywheel or something like that. And essentially what's happening is, because the flywheel is slightly out of balance, it's beating the crap out of the back bearing, because that's where the most imbalance is, and then the front's not as bad. So this engine should be a 50 ounce imbalance. So I'm just going to get another 50 ounce imbalance flywheel, and I'm going to put it back on. I'm not going to worry about it too terribly much. If I get 1,000 kilometers out of this rebuilt engine, that's good enough for me. That should be plenty to break in the car, work out all the bugs, learn the EFI a bit, and get us ready for the longer lived engine for this car. So I'm just going to take some pictures of the rods and kind of how they're sitting. It's always good to have a reference to go back to. So when I'm putting this back together, it's like, oh, that's where this rod was. That's where this rod was. That's where this mark is. That's where this mark is. It just helps. Course, here I am getting the pistons out, and then I get a little bit lazy on this one and I don't have my hand on it, and of course I drop the piston on the floor. It hits my drain pan along the way, makes a huge mess. You know, I shouldn't have not had my hand there to catch the piston as I was pushing it out, but for whatever reason I didn't, and yep, that ends up hitting the floor. I looked at it, it didn't seem to have any issues, so it'll go back in. So now that we have all of the rods off, we have all of the main caps off, we can pull the crank out of the engine. And you can see those are the bearings in the block still, and you can see this last bearing, even the top has a bunch of copper on it, which means that the crank is coming up in the engine, which isn't a typical thing. Usually the pistons are pushing the crank down when it explodes. So the fact that it's kind of come up and hit that bearing means that it was probably out of balance. Either that or, you know, it was just low oil pressure in the back, something like that. So now that I've got the engine apart, I picked up this tray that I had on order, and this is just to keep stuff organized when you're tearing the top end down. You can see I had it done on my teardown tray, no problem, but ideally it's better to have it in this tray. Just kind of keeps it a little bit more secure. So what I'm doing right now is I'm just pulling some of the rings off of one of the pistons, and the reason why I'm doing that is because I want to just very quickly and loosely check some new rings that I got and see what their gaps are in the hole. So when I ring these pistons, I'm shooting for 28 thousandths gap between the ends of the rings. And when I quickly checked this first one, I think it was at like 18 thou, which is obviously 10 thou smaller than what I'm wanting. So I'm going to have to eventually file the rings down in order to get them all to fit into this engine. So with the ring just loosely fit in, I'm using the piston and pushing it down a little bit just to make sure that it's kind of square in the hole. So what we need to do to prepare for getting rings in the block is we need to hone it. So as the piston is going up and down and the piston ring is going up and down, it kind of marks the cylinder a little bit. So what I'm doing is I'm using this ball hone on the drill, and it's going to scuff the surface of the cylinders, and it's actually going to remove some of the metal from the cylinders. And so I'm just giving it a nice crosshatch pattern, and when the rings go in, that's what the rings will seat against. So this is the first time I've ever done this on an engine, and it turned out pretty good as far as I can tell. I've had a few other folks look at it, and there's nothing obviously wrong with it. So we're gonna run with it, and hopefully I get 1,000 kilometers out of the engine. That would be good enough. And at the end of the day, if I haven't blown it up, I could probably sell it for a few $100. Alright, so now that I have finished honing all of the cylinders, I'm going to wash the block out. So, you know, when you're honing, there's some cutting material and some fine metal, and it could get into places. So I'm just going to take some soapy water, or some soapy water, and I'm just going to wash the block down, wash all the cylinders out, wash all of like the water passages out, and then I'm going to dry it all. The last thing you want to do is let water sit in this. It is iron, so it will rust, and rust is like enemy number one in an engine. So I want to make sure as soon as I have finished washing it that I dry it very thoroughly. I'm going to use compressed air. I'm going to use paper towel, and just kind of do whatever I can to make sure that this is dry, and so that there's no rust on any of the mating surfaces for bearings, for the heads, for the lifters, anything like that. I really should have done this part before I even washed the block, but it's not, not the end of the world. I'm just taking off or scraping off the old timing cover gasket. It's on there really, really, really tough. Like, it takes a lot of work to get this off of there. With the block cleaned, what I can do is I can start fitting the crank back in, and one of the things that I need to do is put the new bearings in, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to measure the size of the crank journal with a micrometer, and then I'm going to measure the bearing clearance when the cap is installed and the bearing is installed, just to see how much clearance I'm going to have between the crank and the bearing. Typically, I think you want 1,000 on either side. So now don't quote me on this. I'm not confident in what I'm doing. I'm learning some of this stuff as I go, but I think having 2,000 clearance in your bearings is fully acceptable. Now, if I did this right, I'm gonna have 4 thousandths, which is on the very loose side. But since I don't care too much about this engine, I'm okay with it. I'm just gonna live with it. The only, like, if I wasn't happy with this, so this crank is already 10 thou undersized. So my only option would be to get the crank ground to 20 thou undersized and then put in 20 thou undersized bearings. But for this engine, I don't care. I don't want to spend any more money on it than I already have. So we are just going to put it back together. I'm going to live with the 4 thou. I might have lower oil pressure. And I already know that the back bearing might get beat out of it. But, you know, I'm not going to put it together sloppily. I'm just going to put it together with the understanding that it may not have the longevity that a well-built engine that I spent money, like a good amount of money on, may have. Sorry I didn't get you a better angle of this, but that tool in my hand is the micrometer. It's essentially got 2 metal pieces. One of them screws in and out, and then I can put it over the journal of the crank and kind of move it up and down and get the size of the crank. Now for this portion, I'm not really caring about the actual measurement of it, because I'm going to take this dial bore gauge and I'm going to fit it up inside the micrometer. I'm going to zero it out, and then when I put it in the bearing, it'll tell me how big of a clearance I have. So I don't actually care about the measurement of the bearing. I just want to know how much gap there is. I know, because I'm not showing you a great angle here, you can't really see what I'm doing, but you will get a bit of a better angle in a second here. Alright, so that tool that I'm putting in the vise is the micrometer, and I have locked it to the size of the crank journal. And I'm putting the dial bore gauge in there, and I'm kind of holding it in there and I'm zeroing it out. So what that means is when I'm rocking it kind of up and down and left and right a little bit, the gauge isn't moving at all. So that way I know that it's centered and like the right size to fit perfectly in that crank journal. So you can't really see it, but on the back side there's another little kind of pointy bit that is sitting on the one side of the micrometer, and then there's this pointy bit on the other side. So what's going to happen is once I've zeroed the dial bore gauge in the micrometer, when I pull it out and I go and I push it into the bore, it's going to tell me how much bigger the bore is. I'm terrible at explaining this. If I've just confused the hell out of you, go watch a YouTube on a different YouTube video, a good one on measuring bearing clearances, and you'll get a very clear and much more detailed explanation than I could ever give. So with that done, I am putting all of the bearings into the block. And the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to measure the thrust clearance. So the middle bearing in this on Fords, the number 3 bearing is the thrust bearing, and so what happens with your crank is, like when you push in the clutch, for example, it presses on the crank, kind of pushes it forward a little bit. So there's a bearing that the crank can ride up against in order to, allow that to happen. So one of the things you kind of want to do is you want to measure how much play there is in the crank. You only want to have, I think it's between 4 and 8 thousandths play. And so what you can do is, if you don't have enough movement in the crank, you can sand your bearings down a little bit to get a little bit more clearance. And so you'll see me doing that. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to put the bearing in. I actually removed number 2 and 4 bearings after, so I only need 1, 3, and 5 in. I'm going to torque down the bearing caps, and then I'm going to I'm going to leave 1, 3, and 5 bearing in, put the crank in, and then I'm going to put cap 1, 3, and 5 on. I'm going to take my rubber mallet, tap the crank all the way forward in the block. I'm going to set up a dial gauge indicator on the nose of the crank, and then I'm going to pry back on it with a pry bar, and however far back it moves, that tells me how much thrust clearance I have. Because this is my first time doing this, I didn't really get a great reading all the time, so I kind of took a little bit too much material off my bearing, and I'm at the loose end, but I'm still within tolerance, so I'm not going to get new bearings. I'm just going to live with it. Yeah, so right now I am actually struggling trying to figure out how to get the dial indicator on the magnetic base, and for some reason I just have a hard time and I just can't figure it out. I eventually get it, but yeah, it took me way longer than I should have. Yeah, so here I am getting the dial indicator on the board or on the nose of the crank. I believe I've already tapped it forward, so I take a pry bar, kind of push on the block, pull the crank back, and measure how much play it has. I think on this one I measured 4 thou. And so you're going to see me repeat this process a few times. I'm going to pull the caps off, pull the crank out, and then I'm going to sand the thrust bearings, put it all back together, remeasure, and do this a few times. And then I eventually get smart, and I actually take a dial caliper and I measure how thick the bearing is before I start sanding it down. And then I know exactly how much I've taken off. I didn't do that the first 2 times I was sanding it, so I don't know how much material I removed, but I eventually smartened up and measured and pulled off, the right amount. But I kind of messed up, and as I say, I ended up on the loose side. This entire engine is just a 100% learning opportunity for me, and I love it. I love that I have the ability to use this engine to learn on. It's so valuable. It's just, I'm so thankful to have it. Okay, now that I have a thrust reading that I'm happy with, I'm just going to put the crank in the engine. I'm going to use that red assembly lube that's just on the edge of the bench there. I'm going to put it on all the bearing caps, top and bottom. And what this does is it's a little bit of a sticky oil, so it'll actually stick to the caps. So if you're not firing this up in a relatively quick time frame, it's just going to protect it so that, you know, if you spin the engine at all, it's not going to damage it. You're not going to have metal on metal. You're going to have a little bit of a protection in there. Yeah, so I'm really only putting the crank in here just to get it off the bench. I do need to pull this back out again because I need to replace the rear main seal. I had ordered a new one, but this engine's using an older style two-piece seal, which I didn't know at the time. So when I bought the rear main seal, I bought a single or a one-piece, which is not what I want or can use in this engine. So I'm gonna have to pull this all back apart anyways, but I'm torquing it all up to spec, so that way if I crank or if I spin over the crank, it's not gonna destroy the bearings, it's not gonna destroy the crank. Even though I know I gotta pull it all apart, I want the crank off of the bench so that I can do the ring gapping and whatnot. All right, so with those caps on, it's time for some cleanup. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to clean up the bench a little bit and lay the rings out on the bench and get ready for gapping these. Ring gap is quite important because too much ring gap, you're going to have a lot of oil blowing by the rings, not enough ring gap, and what's going to happen is as the engine and the pistons and the rings heat up, that gap is going to close down to greater than 0, which, you know, if you know anything about physics, matter cannot occupy the same space. So if that ring gap closes up, it's a real bad thing. You're probably going to end up breaking the piston or breaking the ring, and then your engine's gone. You just destroyed your engine because you didn't have enough ring gap. So I'm just going to lay this all out and get ready to do the gapping. Okay, well with that brings us to the end of this week's video. As always, if you've stuck around this long, I'd like to thank you for viewing, and we'll catch you in the next one.